Sometimes, a new beginning isn't about escaping the past, but realizing where fate is leading you. David leaves behind the noise of the city and the weight of his past, seeking a fresh start in a quiet town. But fate has other plans. A storm, a stranger, and a chance encounter that changes everything. In the heart of the blizzard, a light flickers, two lives collide. And sometimes, even the coldest winter can ignite the warmest connection. This is only the beginning. David had worked as a math teacher in the city for years. At first, the bustling streets and vibrant social life excited him. But over time, the noise, chaos, and shallow connections drained him. His personal life was no better. After years of arguments, his marriage ended in divorce, leaving him feeling empty and disoriented. Realizing he needed a change, David began looking for jobs in smaller towns. He found an opening for a math teacher at a local high school and decided to move. The idea of starting fresh in a peaceful town seemed like the escape he needed. He packed his things and moved. For the first time in years, he felt peace with his decision. The town's calm streets and close-knit community were a welcome contrast to city life. He rented a small apartment near the school, avoiding too many possessions so he wouldn't grow attached. Over time, David became friends with Max, the school's energetic PE teacher. Max, noticing David's isolation, made an effort to reach out. Though David found Max's energy tiring at first, he soon appreciated Max's sincerity. When Max learned David liked basketball, he convinced him to play. Despite initial reluctance, David enjoyed the games, and they became a regular tradition. Their friendship deepened, with casual meals and conversations. Max never pressured David to change, but always listened when he spoke. Max and his wife, a kind-hearted woman, invited David over often, ensuring he didn't feel alone. While David remained cautious, he no longer felt like an outsider. Max and his wife had become true friends. When David woke up, the view outside had completely changed. The town was covered in a blanket of white snow that had fallen heavily throughout the night. Snowflakes were still gently drifting down, and the air was becoming harsher. When he arrived at school, the only thing everyone was talking about was the storm that was approaching. The students were excited, while the teachers were worried. Then, an announcement came from the local government. The snowfall would be heavier than expected, roads would be closed, and the temperature would suddenly drop, creating a risk of freezing. Authorities advised everyone to be prepared and, if possible, stay indoors. The news channels were also reporting that the situation was serious. David watched as the townspeople sprang into action. People were rushing to the stores, grabbing their last supplies, and heading back to their homes. As usual, David remained calm. He didn't like to panic. He didn't need much anyway, and he could manage for a few days without going outside. But Max wasn't going to leave him alone. He came up to him and said, "Buddy, stay with us," he said. "The weather is really going to get bad. I don't want you to be alone." David didn't like staying over at someone's house. He liked having his own space and didn't want to be a burden. He politely thanked Max and declined the offer. Max didn't insist, but immediately came up with another plan. "Then at least let's take some precautions," he said. "Let's put chains on our cars and go to the nearby town to get some supplies. The town stores are chaos right now." This made sense to David. He hadn't thought about going to the store yet, but if the storm was going to be as big as predicted, he might not be able to leave for a few days. He and Max got into their cars and headed to a tire shop first. Since the town was used to tough winter conditions, getting the chains on was done quickly. Afterward, they went to a large supermarket in the city. When they entered, there was more of a crowd than they had expected. Some shelves were already empty. People were rapidly grabbing bread, water, and canned goods. As usual, Max took the situation lightly and made jokes, turning the shopping into a fun experience. David, on the other hand, remained more controlled and only picked up what he actually needed. Finally, they went to the checkout, paid, and headed back to their cars to drive back to the town. The weather was getting harsher by the minute. The wind howled as it pushed against the windows, and the snow was turning into a full-blown blizzard. The journey started smoothly, but as they got closer to the town, the situation got more difficult. Visibility had decreased, and the roads had become slippery. David gripped the steering wheel tightly while Max stayed alert. All they could think about now was reaching the town safely. David had turned on the headlights all the way, and the road was becoming increasingly difficult. The snow was turning into a blizzard, and the sound of the wind could even be felt inside the car. As they approached the town, David's eyes briefly landed on one of the detached houses by the side of the road. In the yard, a woman in a red coat was struggling against the wind, trying to unfurl a large tarp. The strong gusts were causing her to stagger, and at times she lost her balance, stumbling. Her movements were becoming slower, and her exhaustion was evident. If you're enjoying the story so far, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like the video. That way, you won't miss any new stories. Now, let's continue. Instinctively, David slowed down and turned to Max. "Should we stop and help?" he asked. Without hesitation, Max nodded. David pulled the car over to the side of the road, and both of them quickly got out and walked toward the yard. The cold air hit their faces sharply, and the wind howled around their ears, growing stronger with each passing second. Max called out loudly, "Hey, need some help?" The woman only noticed them then. It was clear she was exhausted, pausing as she tried to hold onto the tarp and turning to them with a helpless look. "There's a hole in the roof," she said, out of breath. "I just moved in. I'm trying to cover it before the wind gets worse, but I can't do it alone." Without thinking twice, David and Max grabbed the tarp and carried it over to the porch. As the woman followed them, the wind had started picking up. By the time they reached the porch, everyone let out a deep breath. David rubbed his hands together. "If you don't mind, let's take a look," he said. Max chuckled lightly, as if surprised by how quickly David had taken responsibility. David shot him a stern look. This wasn't the time for jokes. The woman immediately nodded, her eyes filled with gratitude. "Please," she said. David exchanged a glance with Max. They quickly decided to check the roof. The outside air was growing colder, and the snowstorm could intensify at any moment. They needed to figure out what to do fast. Max said it was impossible to get on the roof and suggested, "Let's try to handle it from inside." David nodded in agreement. The weather was getting harsher, and working outside was risky. At least by doing something from the inside, they could prevent more water from coming in. Without saying a word, Laura opened the door and invited them inside. As they stepped into the house, the cold immediately hit them. There were unopened boxes and unpacked items everywhere. The furniture was still wrapped in plastic. In the living room, a bucket sat in the middle of the floor, quickly filling up with water. The wind coming through the hole in the roof was making the inside even colder. David looked around, sighing with concern. "You've just moved in," he said. The woman nodded wearily with a soft sigh. "Yes, I moved into the first house I could find in a hurry. I didn't have much time to check it thoroughly," she said, her voice filled with a hint of regret. Max and David exchanged a brief look. The fact that she had come here alone meant she probably hadn't received much support during the move. But now, the main issue was to seal the hole in the roof, even if only temporarily. The woman extended her hand. "I'm Laura," she said, giving them a small smile. David and Max introduced themselves as well. Without lingering in the cold, they immediately got to work. They spread out the tarp on the ground and cut a large rectangle. The plan was to patch the hole from the inside. It wasn't going to be a professional job, but at least it could prevent the water from leaking inside for a while. Neither of them was particularly skilled at this kind of work, but they tried their best. After a few attempts, David decided to climb up to the roof. Using the ladder carefully, he reached the spot with the hole. The wind was trying to push him off balance, and each step required extra caution. Finally, he placed the piece of tarp over the hole from the outside and secured the edges. He wasn't sure how effective it would be, but for now, it was the best temporary solution. When he came back down, Max and Laura looked at him with concern. "I think it'll hold up for a while," David said, breathless. Max added, "Finding a repairman in this weather is impossible. No one will come." A temporary solution was necessary, and this is the best we could do. Laura took a deep breath, nodded, and smiled faintly. "I really appreciate it. If it weren't for you, I don't know what I would have done," she said, her eyes filled with gratitude. David didn't say anything, but inside, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. The peace that comes with helping and being useful. It would take time to get used to this town, but maybe things were progressing differently than he had expected. David and Max said their goodbyes to Laura and left the house. As they got into the car, David paused for a moment while starting the engine, looking ahead thoughtfully. "I feel sorry for her," he said finally. "It must be hard being alone in that house." A slight smile spread across Max's face. He wasn't going to miss this opportunity. Playfully, he teased, "What's she going to do, come with you?" David quickly turned his head to look at him, giving him an irritated look. "That's not what I meant," he said in a sharp voice. Max burst out laughing. Okay, don't get mad," he said, then squinted and nodded slightly. "But I think she likes you." David involuntarily smiled and gave Max a light tap on the shoulder. "A storm's coming, and you're still joking around." Max rubbed his shoulder, grinning. "You need to loosen up, buddy," he said. After a while, David dropped Max off in front of his house. "Come on, go inside so you don't freeze," David said. As Max got out of the car, he raised his hand in a wave. "Take care, man." David gave a slight nod and smiled, then set off toward his own place. When he finally arrived at his apartment, he took off his coat and lit the fireplace. The crackling of the fire echoed through the room's silence. Gradually, the warmth began to spread through the room, making the atmosphere peaceful. He went to the kitchen and made himself a cup of coffee. With his cup in hand, he sat by the window and looked outside. Snowflakes were gently drifting down. The storm hadn't reached its full force yet, but it was very close. The streets of the town were empty. Everyone had retreated into their homes, watching nature's furious display. For a moment, he thought about Laura's house. What was she doing right now? He took a deep breath, sipped his coffee, and let himself sink into the warmth of the fireplace. He felt tired, but perhaps for the first time in a long while, he felt like he had actually done something good. His eyelids grew heavy, and with the comfort of the warm coffee and the peaceful sound of the fire, he drifted off to sleep without realizing it. While the snowstorm continued outside, the warmth of the fire inside offered him a cozy sense of security. When David opened his eyes, he realized the room was almost completely dark. He got up and moved toward the window, and as he looked outside, he was stunned by the scene before him. The snowstorm had intensified to its full force. The wind was so strong that it was impossible to see outside through the window. The storm, which had settled over the town like a white blanket, seemed as if it were sweeping away the entire world. His unease grew. He reached out to press the light switch, but nothing happened. He tried several more times, but the result was the same. The power was out. He frowned and grabbed his phone. Looking at the screen, he saw several missed calls Max. He immediately called him back, and Max picked up after just a few seconds. "Buddy, I was worried." Max's voice came through, tense and serious. David, still not taking his eyes off the window, replied, "I'm fine, but the power's out. Nobody knows when it'll come back," Max said. "The whole town and neighboring towns are affected. Aside from a few places with generators, everyone's in the dark. Don't go outside, the storm's really bad." When Max hung up, David's sense of unease grew even more. One thought consumed his mind: Laura. She had just moved in, with almost nothing in the house, and she was probably alone in the middle of this storm. They had patched the roof, but that was just a temporary fix. If more damage had occurred inside, the house could be freezing cold. David paused for a moment, thinking, should he go? The storm was genuinely dangerous. The roads had become nearly invisible, and as Max said, going outside was crazy. But the thought of Laura being there alone wouldn't leave him. He stood in indecision for a few minutes. Finally, with a sigh, he put on his coat, wrapped his scarf around his neck, and pulled on his gloves. As he made his way to the door, he muttered to himself, "I shouldn't do this." But his steps didn't stop. When he opened the door and stepped outside, the cold hit him instantly. The wind was so strong that even walking was difficult. But David, gritting his teeth, began to push through the snow. Laura's house wasn't far, but in this weather, reaching it would be much harder than he had anticipated. As soon as David got into his car, he thanked the chains they had put on. If Max hadn't thought of it, getting stuck in this storm would have been inevitable. Visibility was almost zero. The wind blew the snow in front of him like a wall, and even the headlights couldn't illuminate enough. He gripped the steering wheel tightly and began to move forward step by step. The road was tough, but the anxiety inside him couldn't stop him. After a challenging drive, he finally reached Laura's house. When he parked the car in front of the door, the intensity of the storm hit him once again. The wind seemed to be trying to push him back. He ran toward the porch, with the snow rising to his knees with every step. When he reached the door, he knocked forcefully. "Laura," he shouted, but he couldn't be sure if his voice was heard. The wind howled so loudly that he could barely hear his own voice. He knocked again, harder this time. Laura. Within a few seconds, the door opened, and Laura's astonished face appeared. Her eyes were wide, as if she had seen a ghost instead of David. When she glanced inside, she immediately understood how bad the situation was. The only light in the house came from a few flickering candles. The windows groaned under the pressure of the wind, and the inside felt nearly freezing. The patch on the roof had completely failed, and water was pouring down from the ceiling like a waterfall. The sound of water pooling on the floor could even be heard. David turned to Laura and, looking into her eyes, said firmly, "You can't stay here." Despite Laura wearing a thick coat, scarf, and hat, her teeth were chattering. The house was so cold that if she stayed for a few more hours, she would surely get sick. At first, she seemed like she wanted to protest, but in the face of David's determined gaze, she stayed silent. She quickly grabbed her bag, and they headed for the porch together. As soon as they stepped outside, the wind hit them so hard it felt like it was trying to lift them off the ground. Laura nearly lost her balance, and David grabbed her arm to steady her. They struggled to reach the car, and as soon as they got there, David opened the door and quickly helped her inside. He sat down, started the engine, and turned on the heaters to full blast. Laura, breathless and disoriented, leaned her head against the seat. "I just had my electric heater, and..." she mumbled. Hearing her exhausted voice, David turned his head slightly toward her. "I know," he said softly. "Please rest." Laura looked as if she had woken from a nightmare. She stretched her hands toward the heater, and as the warmth touched her, she closed her eyes. David watched her carefully. The storm was still raging outside, but at least, for now, Laura was safe. If he hadn't trusted his instincts and set out a few hours ago, Laura would still have been in that freezing house, facing the risk of freezing to death. David turned the key, but there was no sound. He tried again, but the engine wouldn't start. A wave of anxiety rose within him. "Damn it," he thought to himself. He quickly pulled out his phone and called Max. As soon as the phone was picked up, he said quickly, "My car won't start." Max's surprised voice came through immediately. "What? Where are you?" Clenching his teeth, David replied, "I came to pick up Laura." There was a brief silence before Max's laughter echoed in the phone. "Buddy, you're really impossible." David lowered his head, feeling embarrassed. He hadn't done this as an act of heroism. He just hadn't felt right leaving Laura alone. But now, he couldn't help but wonder whether Max might be right. Okay, Max said, still smiling. "Don't leave the car. I'll send help as soon as the storm dies down. You can manage, right?" David sighed and nodded. "Yeah," he said. Somehow, he hung up the phone and turned to Laura. She was looking at him with eyes full of questions. David smiled faintly and shrugged his shoulders. "At least the car's warm," he said. Laura was silent for a moment, then nodded. "Yeah, that's something," she said, her voice tired but at least a little more relaxed. The inside of the car was warm and quiet, a stark contrast to the chaos outside. The wind was pounding against the windows, and while everything outside was being swept up in confusion, here there was, for a moment, a refuge. David watched as Laura reached her cold hands toward the heater. "How long do you think we'll wait?" Laura asked. David shrugged. "We'll have to wait for the storm to calm down a bit. Max is going to send help, but right now, everyone's huddled inside." Laura leaned her head back and closed her eyes. "Today turned out to be much different than I expected," she said with a faint smile. David looked at her, then smiled involuntarily. "Believe me, it has for me too," he said. They both sat quietly, trying to ignore the cold outside as they waited, finding solace in the warmth of the car and the contrast to the brutal winter beyond the windows. As David and Laura waited for the storm to calm down in the warmth of the car, the silence between them gradually faded. They started with small talk about the weather, their first impressions of the town. But soon, the conversation deepened. As David talked about his years as a math teacher in the big city, he realized that, for some reason, he couldn't keep the same distance from Laura as he did with most people. He didn't feel the need to hide anything from her. There was a sense of ease, as if he had known her for years. Over time, Laura relaxed as well. As she reached her hands toward the warm air vent, she began to share her own story. David listened attentively. Laura had grown up in a wealthy but oppressive family. Despite having everything they could ever want, she always felt a sense of emptiness in her life. She spoke of how trying to be someone her family wanted her to be had caused her to lose herself. At one point, she couldn't take it anymore and decided to completely reject them and build her own life. That's why she had come here. She wanted to rebuild her life, live independently, without being reliant on anyone. David was stunned by what he heard. Laura, in a way, had run away just like him. Only he had been trying to leave his past and the people from it behind. But unfortunately, she had chosen the wrong day and the wrong house to move to this town. For a brief moment, David saw traces of her past in her eyes. Although he tried to hide his own wounds, the eyes of someone searching for a fresh start spoke the same truth. Though they came from different backgrounds, they had found each other in the same place. Laura took a deep breath and smiled as she tilted her head slightly. I guess the worst part of deciding to move to this town wasn't the storm, but that old house with the hole in the roof, she said with a touch of irony. David smiled and nodded. And meeting troublemakers like me, he added with a hint of mockery. Laura rolled her eyes but couldn't hide her smile. It's not so clear who's getting themselves into trouble, she replied. As they both smiled, there was a warmth in the car now. Not just from the heat, but from the stories shared and perhaps from the connection they both had been needing for a long time. The storm outside was still raging, but inside, something different was starting to take shape. A few hours passed. As they sat in the car, the attraction between David and Laura became more and more apparent. Their conversations were no longer just words. Their glances, smiles, and even the silence between them spoke volumes. They were both aware of it, but seemed to be waiting for the right moment to say something. Just then, a large vehicle emerged from the storm, slowly approaching them. David straightened up immediately, and when he looked out the window, the strong lights of the vehicle's headlights seemed to explode through the snow. When the vehicle stopped, Max and two burly, bearded men got out. The men didn't seem affected by the cold. They were clearly accustomed to the harsh winters of the town. Max walked directly toward Laura's house and pointed to the men following him. "The best contractor in town, he'll take care of the roof," he said with a smile. Laura's eyes widened with gratitude. "Thank you so much," she said sincerely. The other man wasted no time and popped open the hood of David's car, inspecting the engine. It was obvious he was a mechanic. Max turned to David, raising his eyebrows mischievously and giving him a slight grin. David knew exactly what he meant with that look, but tried not to show it. In about half an hour, all the issues were resolved. Laura's roof was safe, and David's car was running again. The storm was still raging, but at least Laura wouldn't be stuck in a freezing house anymore. David was about to say, "You can stay at my place if you want," but then he hesitated and pulled back. Instead, he took his phone from his pocket and gave her his number. "If anything goes wrong, call me," he said, clearing his throat slightly. Laura took the paper, looked at it for a moment, then smiled warmly. "Of course," she said. The storm lasted for 2 full days. During that time, Laura called David twice. The conversations weren't long, just checking in to make sure he was doing okay. When David said he was fine, the phone call would end after a few simple sentences. But those calls made the warmth inside David grow. When the storm finally ended, the town woke up to a new morning. The sky was clear, and the snow sparkled in brilliant white. David prepared himself with an indescribable feeling and headed to school. It felt like something had changed. That feeling. Maybe it was longing. Maybe it was wanting to see someone again. When he entered the teacher's lounge, someone was already there, standing with their back to him, reading a book in front of the window. The wavy hair falling over their shoulders and their posture were familiar. David took a deep breath. "Good morning," he said naturally. When the woman turned to face him, David's heart almost stopped. It was Laura. In that moment, time seemed to freeze. As he stared at her in shock, Max walked in, grinning mischievously as usual. "Oh, I forgot to tell you. While you were up on the roof, Laura told me. She's our new literature teacher," he said, winking. 1,000 thoughts rushed through David's mind, but the only thing he could say, the honest sentence that came from his heart, was, "I'm so happy to see you." Laura smiled softly. The warmth in her eyes told David everything. Love had begun. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and click the join button for more content. Your support means the world to us. See you in the next story.